Let us turn now to a fairly brief survey of the figure of the warrior in both myth and history. And perhaps start once again with the ancient Greeks, because we find there perhaps one of the most famous of all warriors, the figure of Achilles. Achilles is an individual who, at very early on, is prophesied to either gain glory and die young, or live a long but uneventful life in obscurity. And Achilles pointedly chooses the former in joining the Trojan War. Achilles turns out to be a fearsome warrior, a formidable asset for his side in the Trojan War, but also a liability due to his bouts of rage, his out-of-control aggressiveness. And so in Achilles we have this dual figure, once again, of an individual who is useful to his political community, but at times may be damaging to it because of his own individual pursuit of meaning in war. A famous warrior culture, of course, can be found in that of the Vikings, between the 8th and the 11th century, known as some of the most fearsome warriors of their time. Notably among them we find the so-called berserkers, elite troops who fought in a trance-like frenzy that rendered them ferocious and utterly fearless. When we turn our attention to the mythology of the Vikings, Norse mythology, we see that the account we're given is one in which those who die in combat are to be transported by the Valkyrie, female warrior angels, to Valhalla, the court of Odin, the highest god within the Norse pantheon, and of course the god of war. And what do these Vikings do in the afterlife? They fight during the day and they feast at night, during which wounds are healed. So heaven for Vikings is just war without end. Well, I say without end, but in fact the prophecy is that all this fighting eventually culminates into Ragnarok, the battle prophesied to end in the destruction of the Viking gods. On the other side of the world, of course, we also encounter one of the most famous warrior cultures, the Bushido, associated with the samurai. And the Bushido is effectively a code of conduct which existed in some shape or form between the 9th century and modern times. One that stressed courage, loyalty, frugality, and honor. The samurai were, throughout this period, recognized as high status individuals, trained expertly in sword fighting, and emblematic of this high-minded idea of the warrior. And within this warrior culture, a very marked, striking relationship to death was cultivated. As the Hagakure, a guide to the warrior written in 1716, puts it, the way of the samurai is death. If you are required to choose between life and death, choose without hesitation death. The point being here that true nobility is found in a commitment to the samurai code over life itself. And so the samurai are required to go in battle having already accepted death. And moreover, that it does not matter whether their eventual death has served a purpose or permitted the attainment of a goal, but simply that it be honorable. We do not even find within this culture the notion of a reward in afterlife. You will not be, in a sense, rewarded for your actions in this world. It is the honorable death itself that is its own reward. We find this further affirmed through the highly ritualized form of suicide known as seppuku, whereby a dishonored samurai would choose to perform an act of self-disembowelment rather than be faced with dishonor. As one 20th century commentator of the Hagakure, Mishima, we'll talk about in a moment, put it, even a merciless death, a futile death, that knows neither flower nor fruit has dignity as the death of a human being. If we value so highly the dignity of life, how can we not value the dignity of death? There is once again within this idea of the samurai code a recurrent protest against the idea of utility, of usefulness. Conformity with the code, honor must be its own goal. It must not be subjugated to any other ulterior motive. Now, it's worth noting nonetheless that the high point of the samurai culture is one that occurred in the 16th, 17th and 18th century, or 17th and 18th centuries, a period during which Japan was essentially at peace and during which there was not much for the samurai to do. So one might critically appraise some of the rhetoric around the samurai as being part of a certain aestheticization and romanticization of a warrior culture that really had not a lot to do with the reality of it. And there is, of course, a disconnect between the high values of the warrior cultures and the much more messy reality of war. But for all that, the very aspirational nature of these values still are, I think, revealing. But it is important, nonetheless, to retain some critical distance to some of the claims being made about warrior cultures. Moving on, in the 20th century, we encountered the figure of Ernest Junger, a prominent writer of the 20th century, most known for his diaries or his accounts of his time in the front line in the First World War, in particular the book Storm of Steel. And Junger really fits the archetype of the warrior rather well and expresses many ideas that we've already encountered. For example, he writes that it's possible that we are sacrificing ourselves for something inessential in the context of the First World War. But no one, he says, can rob us of our value. Essential is not what we are fighting for, but how we fight. Onward toward the goal until we triumph or are left behind. The warrior spirit, the exposure of oneself to risk, even for the tiniest idea, weighs more heavily in the scale than all the brooding about good and evil. Finally, let's return to a figure I briefly evoked, Japanese writer Yukio Mishima. Mishima is a singular figure, one who grew up in post-war Japan, profoundly dissatisfied with the Japanese society he saw. That came, of course, in the aftermath of the total defeat of the Second World War. And who, among his numerous writings, produced a commentary on the Hagakure, on this traditional text on samurai conduct. And here found a description of the samurai which he highlighted because of how distinct he saw it in contrast to the forms of life that were prevalent in post-war Japan. A samurai, he says, is a total human being, whereas a man who is completely absorbed in his technical skill has degenerated into a function, one cog in a machine. Mishima was expressing a protest against a modern society in which individuals could no longer be autonomous, self-governing moral agents, but were subsumed into wider socio-technical systems. And this, of course, is rather indicative of the tendency within war itself that we will come to in a moment. Mishima's ending itself is revealing. In 1970, he stormed the Japanese self-defense headquarters with his acolytes, and in the photo on the right, marched out on the balcony to harangue the troops below and incite them to restore the power of the emperor. He was roundly ignored and jeered, at which point he returned to the building and committed seppuku. So that was the end of Mishima, and in some ways perhaps the end of a certain conception of the warrior, or at least one of the clear markers that the figure of the warrior was one in crisis.